You're tuned in to the Summit High School KMNT Progressive Radio's Big Question Spotlight. I'm your host, Andrew Skidmore. Today's segment is going to look at the various ways in which our political and economic systems put people's lives in danger, as well as how our media and government value profit over human life. Today's big question comes from a grieving mother. This question is it our duty to sacrifice the people for economic growth? This is the question Yakimi Takahashi was left to ponder after she lost her daughter to death by overwork, known in Japan as Karoshi. Her daughter, Matsuri Takahashi, committed suicide due to work-related stress after months of grueling overtime shifts. This problem affects many more families than just the Takahashis, as Karoshi has been a legally recognized cause of death in Japan since 2015, and it claims thousands of lives per year. According to Statista, Karoshi deaths peaked in 2011 at 2,689, but have remained high with 1,949 deaths in 2019. The parents of these Karoshi victims are now finding themselves reaching the same tragic revelation that Takahashi had, saying, quote, "As a mother, I could not protect her from the company." And the government did little to protect her daughter as well. Bills passed in Japanese parliament in response to Karoshi still allow for up to 80 hours a month of overtime work. This overtime work contributes to stress, exhaustion, and depression, all of which are factors in Karoshi death. This raises the question of whether these bills were passed in a sincere attempt to limit Karoshi deaths, or were rather the government's way of keeping its reputation intact as its citizens suffer. After the death of her daughter, Yakimi Takahashi was left with nothing but grief and questions. The questions she had to ask herself are the same ones we're pondering now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. This question of is it our duty to sacrifice the people for economic growth is more relevant than ever. COVID-19 has claimed over 513,000 lives in the US alone. Experts agree that the best way to keep yourself and others safe is to stay home. Yet the message coming from media outlets like Fox News is to go back to work. This message is having real-world consequences. According to a study published in the Washington Post, quote, "Infection and mortality rates are higher in places where one pundit who initially downplayed the severity of the pandemic, Fox News' Sean Hannity, reaches the largest audiences." It's not only corporate-owned media outlets that are prioritizing economic growth over human life, it's our own government. There's no better example of this than Texas's decision to reopen their economy. When the lieutenant governor was questioned on this decision, he said, quote, "There are more important things than living." This economic growth over human lives attitude is prevalent at all levels of government. President Trump spent months downplaying the risk of the virus and telling people to go back to work. Moreover, Trump's delayed reaction is largely responsible for the hundreds of thousands of deaths that we're experiencing. According to an article from Business Insider, quote, "The White House started issuing social distancing guidelines on March 16th, more than 2 weeks after the first COVID-19 related death. However, an estimated 90% of coronavirus deaths in the US could possibly have been avoided if social distancing had begun on March 2nd. According to two health experts. The indifference to the danger that COVID-19 poses is proof of one thing, that our political establishment believes it is indeed the duty of the people to sacrifice themselves for economic growth. COVID-19 is the American Karoshi. It's our epidemic of death from being compelled to work when that work is unsafe. Like the victims of Karoshi, our essential workers are being compelled to work by power structures that prioritize profit over human life. COVID-19 and Karoshi both represent the reality that humanity's greatest threats aren't from the world outside ourselves, but rather our own political and economic systems. Our government, the media, and corporations all pose a clear and present danger to the American working class. Now that we've reached a point where our political mechanisms we've set up to protect ourselves are the very thing that we need protection from. So as we reach the end of this week's Big Question Spotlight, I want us to ponder one more question. What can we do to change this reality? Now that we've seen our political and economic systems' indifference to human life, we should ask ourselves what we can change. These necessary changes might seem frightening or radical at first, but I want us to keep in mind today's big question. Is it our duty to sacrifice ourselves for economic growth? If you don't believe that it is, then change is necessary.